the first thing I wanted to say really is I know you're a visual and media seminar, and I'm actually working in a rather different way with this material. I mean, this is very much a sort of historical study. I came to this as somebody who was interested in the sort of history of cultural production, and the cinema seemed an attractive field for it. I mean, I've been interested in a sort of amateurish way in the Soviet cinema for quite a long time, which started when I was actually there as a student. And if you were in a Soviet provincial town as a student in 1980 to 1981, so the Brezhnev era, there wasn't all that much. This is Voronezh. I mean, it did have an opera theatre, it did have a concert hall, it did have a fairly okay drama theatre, but on the whole, the repertoire tended to be not really that appealing, certainly to a Western outsider. Whereas on the other hand, the cinema, even if it was Soviet popular films, was always interesting. And it was also the kind of, had the liveliest audiences. It was definitely a sense that people were in the cinema because they wanted to be there. So I haven't actually done this research as an audience study. I mean, there are some big difficulties with that. It's very poor in data. Unfortunately, film studios just threw away the letters that they got from viewers. I mean, you know, it seems shocking, and it seems also astonishing in the context of a culture where you sometimes get the impression that almost everything was kept, including things which would be quite discreditable later on to the people who created those documents. But it does seem to be like that. And one gets occasional examples, but there isn't really enough to get a sort of slice of reception of the sort that you get in, say, Denis Kozlov's book on Novy Mir, and particularly the chapter there on Ivan Denisovich, where there's just many dozens, if not hundreds of letters that he's able to draw on. And I don't know of any Soviet film, certainly made in Leningrad, where there's anything like that amount of material. So I sort of work with the material, if you like, and it is a production history. And when I say beyond censorship, I mean, I've recently written an article. Well, it was actually not so recently written, but it's coming out in the next issue of Slavonic Review in London. And when I got the readers' reports, a couple of them sort of objected strenuously to the idea of ditching the term of censorship. And I don't mean to ditch it altogether, but I don't think that the term censorship is actually all that revealing in the Soviet context. The British cinema had the British Board of Film Censors, and what the film censors did, and what they still do, they're called something else now. It's called the British Board of Film Classification. They've removed that naughty word from it, but it does much the same, which is to sort of review films, insist occasionally that things are cut out if it's going to get certificated at all, and assign the films to different viewing categories, depending on whether they're seen as child-friendly or exactly the opposite. That is a much simpler process, and it's also a process of a distinct separation of powers, so that there's an institution which reviews films and there's an institution that produces films, and those two things are independent. Obviously, we don't have state film studios in the way that in Britain, in the way that was true of the socialist world, or much of the socialist world, certainly of the Soviet Union. So that's one major difference. And the other thing is that it's very difficult to separate the mechanisms of production and the mechanisms of what in Russian were known as control, or sort of control, so management in a broader sense. So when somebody receives the first draft of a script and sends a friendly letter saying, well, I think this is really interesting, but maybe you could think about, reworking the first scene because I don't think it's very convincing. I mean, is that censorship? I think if people were asked that in the context of a Soviet studio or an independent producer or a Hollywood film studio, they would probably say no. When they're asked that in the context of a Soviet film studio, they tend to say yes. And that, to my mind, is actually making all sorts of arbitrary sort of decisions about what is seen in what way, and often actually imposing external categories on Soviet film production. And particularly with people of the older generation, that tends to be seen as the sort of, discussion of an idiot who hasn't really understood anything about the way that Soviet film studios worked. Although people who've worked with Soviet film studios, as opposed to people who've just watched films, tend to respond to it rather more warmly. What I'm going to talk about here is what I've called managing the visuals. So the first thing is, I'll just sort of show you the front cover of the book. So this is going to knock on. Yes, brilliant. And I mean, I like the coffee stain around the outside, which is entirely the creative work of PowerPoint, but is very suitable for a place that ran on coffee and where a lot of the discussions happened in the cafe. That's a sort of pure accident and is related to a completely different, it's a visual realization of another part of the work, which is talking about the sort of day-to-day process of making films and exactly the sort of, you know, coffee conversations, that sort of thing. I mean, people getting drunk in the film processing workshop. So there's various kinds of rich anecdotal detail of that sort. But one point is to sort of, you know, make the point on the front that the films do have a visual record. So part of what I'm drawing on is going to be the production stills, so that the folders, which are still held to a substantial degree in the archive of Len Film itself, which were originally often done for publicity. So they were done to, you know, kind of, for example, produce an attractive image that might be used on some form of advertising, although advertising, as we'll see a little bit later, was rather rudimentary. And they're also sort of there to provide a kind of record. So this рабочий момент is the Russian for it, literally a working moment. So something that shows the film being made would not really be for advertising, but it's much more to sort of, as it were, have a record of the film. It might be used in exhibitions of 10 years of Len Film at the studio, that kind of thing. If the director was really famous, it might go into sort of biographies, that kind of status. So I'll come back to those a little later, but I'm going to start with a sort of general spread of how the sort of process works. And I should perhaps emphasize that Len Film is and isn't a kind of template for how Soviet studios worked. The thing is that there are some similarities in the process right across the Soviet Union. And on the other hand, there are ways in which each film studio is slightly different. Mosfilm was different because it was twice the size of the next largest studio, which is in fact Len Film. So Mosfilm is the largest feature film studio in the Soviet Union, and Len Film is the second largest feature film studio, but only half the size of Mosfilm. And that includes everything: territory, number of films issued, staffing, and most particularly the budget. I mean, I would be surprised if the overall budget of Mosfilm was actually as small as only twice the budget of Len Film. It was hugely generously bankrolled compared to everything else. And then there's a sort of ranking of film studios as you go down. I mean, just in terms of size, which actually does correlate reasonably well with their standing, also their perceived importance. So Gorky Studios in Moscow is the third biggest. Then the Kiev studio, Davrenka, is the fourth biggest. And so you go on, and you get down to Gruzia Film, which, for instance, which releases about 6 films a year instead of, you know, Len Films is more like 30, including the shorts and the you know, occasional documentaries, advertising films occasionally for things like Soviet insurance and so on, TV films, which become very important. So Georgia Film has got a smaller number of those, but a very high standing. So it has a hugely high artistic standing and problems with getting audiences into the cinemas. So there are all kind of paradoxes which I can't really talk about here, but it's quite a complicated process and not the sort of thing which comes out particularly well in histories to date of the Soviet cinema, good as they are in many ways, which sort of focus on the films themselves without any sort of sense of that wider background. So here's a sort of schedule, which, as I say, is based on Len Film, so that on the left-hand side, you see the sort of institutional structures which a particular stage of the film's production was reviewed by. And on the right-hand side, you see what the, or rather the left-hand side is the actual phases, and the right-hand side is the institutional mechanisms. So the proposal, zayavka, you could also call that a pitch if you wanted to, or a treatment. So this is a sort of idea for the film, would be reviewed in the studio only, and that can often be quite informal. So somebody would just look through that and, you know, write back and say, you know, yes, this looks like quite a good idea. No, we already got 3 of those on the kind of so-called perspective plan. So the forward plan for this year. No, that's a thumping cliche. No, it's really badly written, you know. I mean, they are incredibly frank when they don't like things, and they write back to the sort of people who submitted something saying, you don't know anything about the studio. This is really terrible. We can't possibly deal with it. And it's very bracing. They had to answer these letters. I mean, often they had things forwarded by Catriona, which was the mechanism at the center, and they would be almost equally rude with those if they didn't like them. And then at a later stage, the zayavka has to be sort of formally adopted, formally reviewed, but it's not actually till you get up to the level of the complete literary scenario that it goes through the main institutional mechanisms of the studio. So that is from 1961, the so-called creative units, certainly at the bigger studios. So these were subdivisions of the studio with various levels of control over what went out. So in Mosfilm, they were really like mini studios. They had a lot of control over budget. In Lenfilm, they were more like kind of editorial and reviewing mechanisms. So they didn't have control over budget, but they did review the various stages of what we would call the script. And I've retained the Russian fairly literal translations there, because I think that's important in order to reflect the fact that this actually didn't work exactly like the process would if you sent something to the BBC, which in some ways is not unlike the process of dealing with a Soviet state film studio. And one of the things that people tend to forget if they work on, Hollywood cinema, for example, is that many European countries, and that includes Britain, have got state controlled broadcasting, and that actually state controlled broadcasting has many of the same constraints as state controlled film production, including some of the sort of toing and froing with government, like it and don't like it. I mean, we're of course uncomfortably aware of this at the moment with public broadcasting in Britain, because we've got a government which is extremely irritable about kind of, perceived bias. I mean, it's actually getting quite Soviet about this in some respects. But anyway, to return to the chart, and then you see that the final version of the sort of the initial script, this literary scenario, is not just reviewed in the studio, but also by the City Committee of the Communist Party in Leningrad. It could be the Central Committee if it's a Soviet Republic. So in the Moscow studios, it was the Central Committee of the Communist Party, but it's the leading Communist Party organ with a cultural department in the particular place where the film is being made. And then it goes to Catriona after approval by the party, which, by the way, is extremely light touch usually with this, and not at all what people often think about when they talk about party censorship. The party had many things to do which were not managing the film industry. And if you look at so far as these things are open, the open and accessible to researchers records of the Communist Party leadership in Leningrad, you see that actually they were far more interested in discussing tractor output than they were in discussing culture. So they didn't actually review things an awful lot. They delegated it to an office of the of the City Committee of the Communist Party. And so a lot of films just went through on the nod. There's really very little intervention at the party level. It's not minuted. It's very difficult to find out what's said, but you can sometimes see the sort of feedback the party wanted us to change the scene because the representation of the party member was, or more likely the party secretary, somebody relatively senior, was, as one person rather endearingly said, it was a party secretary, and he said, "I've never met a party secretary like this, and I don't know what you had in mind." So he was quite offended on his own behalf and behalf of his colleagues. And then the screen tests. So in Russian, proby, so literally the tryouts, are approved by Catriona, but essentially the casting is done entirely in studio unless something very bad goes wrong, that they really don't like the original casting, and there's some reason for coming back on that. There's then, I won't go into sort of variation at different eras, because they introduced an intermediate stage at one point in the early 70s, but the next important stage is the director's scenario, literally, but the shooting script, which includes, so this is the first point at which visual material actually is made manifest in the text that's being reviewed by the studio. And I'll show you in a second an excerpt from one of these, what it actually looks like on the page. Then material in Russian, literally material. So that could be applied both to raw footage that's pretty well just come out of the camera, and rough cuts, so черный монтаж. And then the, sort of the first kind of director's cut, is reviewed in the studio. Again, not systematically. This phase very much depends on whether this film is sort of seen to be kind of something of a threat. And the more threatening it seemed to be, the more people who will insist on watching this rough footage and then kind of, making criticisms of it. And then it's made into a version on 2 reels, and then that gets really quite a lot of reviewing. So what do we see? We see the number of agencies and institutions that's involved in reviewing the version on 2 reels. So the final versions is much larger than any other point. But on the other hand, that means that each of them is has got less kind of a foothold on the material. And there's, of course, as always in any bureaucratized society, whether that's a university or anything else, there's always the possibility of argument between them, assiduously played off by those who are submitting material, who are kind of, keen to, go further up the line and sort of, pour garbage on people lower down the line and so on. And then the other thing is that the visuals, you might think, are scrutinized by more bodies, but there's relatively less expertise in those bodies. So the expertise is really concentrated in the Soviet reviewing process on the verbal script and on things like characterization, dialogue, and so on. So I've tabulated that there. So more time and expertise is spent on the script than anything else. The complete film was seen by more bodies than anything else, but the amount of time spent on it was less. And that filtration, which is another term used in the Soviet cinema, filtratia alongside control, was mainly carried out by people at all the different levels who are not expert on the visual side of film. So that's another kind of quite revealing thing. So that the creative units might have, in the artistic council, which is the main body for reviewing things, they might have, say, 1 leading camera operator. That was about where it went as far as having expertise went. The external people who were sitting on the boards were kind of writers, they were academics, they were sort of various people in the Communist Party, there were sort of, people like sociologists, they introduced people also like psychologists, but they will mainly not talk about films. So, again, I interviewed a leading camera operator, then Marina Samsonova, who I think is a part of the audience, also interviewed at least 1 camera operator. And one of the things that they will say is that you were lucky. It's a bit like being a translator in a British newspaper. You're lucky if you just get 1 complimentary remark. That will be sort of, and I'll give you a few examples of that. I think I've got some of those included later on. But on the left-hand side, anyway, you have sheet number 179 of the shooting script of a film that I'm going to talk about slightly later. I've got 3 examples, as my synopsis made clear, of films where I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about that filtration process and how it worked. And this is from Friends and Years, which was released in 1965. Director is a very talented and underrated, certainly in the West, director called Viktor Sokolov. Very interesting also social background, because he was one of the few directors, certainly at Len Film, who came from a genuinely working class background. Very unusual, despite the fact that it's an egalitarian society, and in some ways genuinely is, and others less so. But anyway, the point here is the sort of generic one. This is what a shooting script looks like, and I'm afraid it's rather faint, but starting from the left, you can see the type of shot, then you can see information about the lens that you're using, about the aperture, and then on the right-hand side, you have information about the soundtrack, which is here not being filled in, but sometimes it'll sort of say, Bach partita being played on the piano very badly or something like that. Or maybe they wouldn't add the very badly because they wouldn't want to get criticized for that. So it's minimum information, technical information. And I haven't ever come across a case when somebody sort of said, your idea is absolutely wonderful, but I wouldn't use the A2 aperture in that scene. It just doesn't get reviewed at that level at all, as far as I know. Sorry, I'm a bit husky, so I'm having a bit of water, but I will return to the fray in a minute. So assessing scripts, which will allow me to pause a bit and gather for breath, because I can sort of leave you to look at this example. A very typical example on an early stage of a script so as I mentioned, the two things that really matter are the dialogue. Here, the reviewer, Michael Bleiman, is concerned it might be a bit vulgar. And then also the characterizations, whether these are well-written roles. And again, one of the things that I've said about the aesthetic is that there isn't actually, at this level, such a vast difference between the sort of comment you get in Soviet studios and the sort of comment you get on Rotten Tomatoes from professional film critics these days. It's middle of the road film criticism, sort of non-technical film criticism, which is the sort of stock in trade of the Soviet cinema, and is far more common that at this period, I should say, because I mean, one of the reasons I think why people have got irritated with the idea of toning down censorship as they see it in the Soviet cinema is that this would have looked very different in 1935. But in the 1960s, 1970s, it's moved away from that exceptionally vividly ideologized strategy, and is, as I say, rather more middle of the road. I don't like the word normalization too much, but it seems in some ways reasonable for this period in this industry. Now, occasional comments on visual aesthetics. So this is a nice one. So this is Joseph Heifetz, who is an extremely senior director with a very strong interest in actually extremely beautiful, but rather for this generation, this is after all the 1960s, conventional visuals. And he doesn't want an actress cast because he thinks she has an ugly chin. And so this thing of this is cinema after all. So one of the interesting things about the Soviet cinema is trying to sort of balance the sort of realism imperative. I mean, people should look like real people, and one shouldn't underrate that actually, because Soviet actors of this period, so 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, really do look like more like real people than they often do in Western cinema. I think it's absolutely fair to say. And that's still to some extent true about art film in former socialist countries. So I'm just watching my way through a playlist for the Golden Arch Film Prize. And I mean, I've seen some really striking examples of that. So, you know, people with faces that you're just not used to seeing in the cinema, and you understand eventually why it's so dislocating. It's because you're so used to seeing them in real life. And there's this sort of especially large gap, I think, now. I mean, Instagram has got an awful lot to answer for, and that includes in the post-Soviet Russian cinema as well. So a film like, for instance, very good film actually, which is Serebrenikov's Leta, or Summer, and the central female character. I mean, if you compare photographs of her, which is, you know, she was quite solid, but there's an absolutely sort of wispy, you know, kind of probably 48 kilo beauty who's been chosen to play her. And it just, you know, none of the men kind of look like that. And it really is a sort of, you know, glamorization, insta-glamorization of the medium, which I find really rather regrettable in some ways, to be honest, and especially in historical perspective. So I'm not sort of saying that you know, the Soviet cinema people always kind of thrown out of screen tests on exactly this sort of grounds, but it's interesting to see a film director of the earlier generation sort of actually making this point about an actress who seems, when you look at her photograph, to be actually pretty good looking. Then there's another type of, you know, this is a film, I should point out these are actually the same film. So this is the film called Mothers Got Married, made by Vitaly Melnikov. The script is by Yuri Klepikov. So these are two kind of young Turks, very important figures of the 1960s. Both of them went on to make really outstanding careers in the Soviet cinema, sort of not nearly as well known again in the West as they should be. And this was a sort of classic example of something which really does approach visual censorship, yes, which is all sense of proportion and taste deserts the director when it comes to the scenes on the roof. And the problem is that these women are sunbathing in their underwear, which is very widespread in the Soviet Union. People, you know, it was difficult to get swimming costumes. Actually, this underwear is really rather glamorous by Soviet or any other standards. I mean, it's kind of a sort of shiny black bra and, you know, kind of fits the person that it's wearing it pretty well. And And she's very kind of obviously picturesquely sort of, posed on that parapet. They're actually builders. They're mending or conserving a building. So they're master builders who are working on the reconstruction for conservation purposes of a major 19th century building in Leningrad, which is also quite interesting. So it's not just sort of about hods of cement, but it's also about their kind of relationship with the cultural fabric of the city. But it does actually sort of fit the ethics of the time. It's easy to laugh at this. And Irina Kokorova, who is the sort of person from Goskino, she was the deputy editor of the Scenarios and Editorial College, which sort of, had the primary line of reviewing films for Goskino. She had a senior position in that, therefore, as sort of chief editor. And she was notorious for finding sort of obscenity in absolutely everything. I mean, it was sort of a joke that it's just as well that it was Shakespeare who wrote Romeo and Juliet, because otherwise Kokorova would have said that they shouldn't be kissing. I mean, this sort of thing. And it's always men making those jokes, so that one has to be a bit careful about using this as evidence of what she was actually like. But nevertheless, the documents that I've seen suggest that she really was quite hair trigger as far as these sort of, stimuli from visuals and indeed kind of vulgar language as well. So when the film is edited, these films must be cut out and, cut out altogether, first of all, significantly reduced, then she sort of, changes her mind and it goes out like that, or somebody higher up the line. But I think, no, she signed the letter, so she made the correction. So there, as I say, we do get something which is very like visual censorship in the way we'd understand it in the West. Something lands on the cutting room floor. I mean, that's the sort of primary understanding of censorship. And it does happen in other cases. I mean, Yuri Fight, who made a well-known film, especially well-known now, it's been fortunately kind of revived for posterity, called A Boy and a Girl. And he literally, with a piece of the film that was cut out right at the final stages, so there was a sort of scene of these young people far too closely intertwined for Soviet morality. So when that was cut out, it landed on the floor. He picked it up and stuck it in his pocket, and it's now been put back in the film. So there's now a version with this sort of fragment which has been re-edited back into it. So those are very simple cases, and ones that are nagliedny in Russian, so that can be sort of, illustrated visually. So sort of good for this sort of presentation. Slightly more complicated cases. Now, these come from a film by Dinara Asanova, who's extremely interesting, both as another case of a young generation director, but also as a woman director at a period when Lenfilm only had 2 women directors working in a kind of mainstream way. And the other was Kira Muratova, who made 1 film and is much better known for her work at other studios. So Dinara Asanova had kind of made it in a men's world. It was very much a men's world. Lenfilm didn't have even 1 camera operator, so that's also quite revealing. Even 1 camera operator who was female. There were few at Mosfilm. Interestingly, Lenfilm not, possibly because of the training through immensely senior older camera operators. Andrei Moskvin, for example, who was still around in the late 50s, early 60s. And with the directors, paradoxically, I mean, the reforms in 1961 brought in more young people, and in many ways were kind of a rejuvenation of the list, but the female directors were largely kind of removed. There was actually a more senior one, sorry, it should really be 3, including Muratova, who is Nadezhda Kashivierova, who is best known for a film that she made in the late 40s, Cinderella, and made these sort of stylized fairy tale type films. Quite an interesting director, although not my cup of tea. So to be honest, for that reason, I didn't concentrate on her so much. But I got myself off the hook by choosing the younger generation directors, who were the ones that I happened particularly to like also. But anyway, what we see in this scene is a continuity issue. So the child actress has got taller. So what's happened? Her skirt has got too short, is what's meant. So be very careful about, you can't reduce the size of the girl. You can't lengthen the skirt. So what you do is you take out the sort of sensitive bits where the skirt is just a little bit kind of too racily short. And you can just about see it in this image, that you can see it's some way above the knee. She's rather tall and leggy. And of course, she's quite well developed compared with the boy. I mean, there's a sort of classic hiatus between sort of the way that the clock of puberty is working in each case. So that's another one. I mean, sort of continuity, what you do when something, is out of kilter, say, or doesn't seem suitable. And there is a very close intersection with censorship in the way that we'd call it, and sort of filtration in the Soviet cinema, because the main person responsible for vetting Soviet films is somebody who sits on set to make sure that the script is being followed. They don't have a continuity person at all. It's all left to other members of the crew. And that's a change in the post-Soviet Russian cinema, the fact that there is such a person. So in the West, this might be a continuity issue. Here it's an editorial issue and a sort of screening filtrazzi issue, which with overturns also of some sort of dissatisfaction with this. Something else that's interesting, though, is that people, because there was so little expertise in vetting visuals, could actually quite often miss the point. So that these apparently quite harsh cuts to the filmic world could actually end up being less harsh in reality than they might seem when you see them sort of stipulated on the page. So the director of Len Film writes to Guskino to sort of say, more or less, we've done what you wanted this removed, you wanted that kind of reshot, we've done it, and the ending of the film has been changed. The ending of Soviet films is particularly sensitive. It's there that people look for unduly pessimistic moods. They're always on the watch for pessimistic moods. Those are very bad. And a film that sort of ends with a downbeat ending is really not at all welcome. And it actually goes into a viewer aesthetic too. So I remember a kind of highly intelligent friend over in Britain in the late 1980s, had been in Britain before, in fact, watching the house on the Black Hill, sorry, which is based on a Bruce Chatwin novel, and saying, oh, it was such a inspiring film. It had this optimistic ending, which seemed kind of really very weird to those people who were not kind of used to that aesthetic appreciation. This is somebody whose attitudes couldn't be described as Soviet in most ways, but it's a kind of expectation of that. And you would look at the visuals there also. But actually, they didn't look very closely, because even though the film had been trimmed of the shot which showed Mukhas, he's the teenage hero. You saw him in the previous shot as well, with the sort of his leggy kind of female friend. They have this sort of platonic friendship. And she's going away. She obviously comes to the Soviet viewer from a very different social background. It's never going to work in the long term. And so he, in the original version, was sort of, there actually despairing and weeping. It's removed. But on the other hand, the effect of the shot where he desperately follows the train going right the way down the platform, and you see the train inexorably pulling away from him, and then he's sort of panting to follow it, and then he slows down, is exactly the same, actually in a subtler and more, I think, rewarding way than it would have been with the sort of, the very obvious communication of the fact that this is a sort of desperate moment for him. You've kind of got enough there in the visuals to tell you that anyway. So I think that's a very interesting case of the sort of double-edged characteristic. I mean, that not everything that was recommended as a change necessarily made the film worse, insofar as one can tell, because you can't watch the different versions one against the other and make that judgment, but you're extrapolating from different pieces of evidence about the versions. And B, that the pessimism, in other words, that the change had been made, people were not looking too carefully at the film second time round, and they just basically signed off the change and didn't sort of really consider the impact. Now, coming to the final case, which is Viktor Sokolov's Friends and Years, which I've already mentioned. And this is a film which cuts a really broad swathe through Soviet history, starting in the Stalin era. So sort of starting in the time of the first 5-year plans, really, continuing to the optimistic stage of the constitution. And then it goes through the war, the years after the war, and eventually takes you up to the late 1950s. So it must be about 25 years of history that it covers. It's based on a well-known and a popular at that stage play by Leonid Zorin, so a leading Soviet playwright of the late Soviet period. Sokolov worked extensively on the script. So the script is to a large extent his work as well as Leonid Zorin's, but it's, the basic story is there from Zorin. First thing is, don't judge the film on this really very conventional piece of advertising, because this is really to show you the problems with film advertising. I mean, this is something that would really not make you want to see this film properly, probably. I mean, the difficulty with advertising is that people didn't really get access to it much. I mean, it lies around in the studio archive. So what they tended to see more was small ads in the local newspaper that told them that something was showing, that and word of mouth. So, you see something is on at the Red Flag Cinema, and you ring a friend and say, is Friends in Years any good? And the friend says, oh, I saw that last night and it's absolutely wonderful. You have to go and see that. And then you hope there are tickets. So the advertising is sort of a secondary consideration. But anyway, I mean, just to sort of show you an example from the visuals of the film, it's made in black and white. So the sort of, Soviet Technicolor shot that we just saw is not actually a good reflection of how it was filmed, but there's a big pressure on Soviet film directors at this period, filmmakers generally, to start using color. So color is the thing. It's you have to actually start fighting to use black and white already by the mid-1960s. And by the end of the 1960s, it's really pretty well impossible to get a film through unless you have really big pull in black and white. But anyway, you see here another Рабочий момент, sort of working moment, and a really strong sense of what the photography in the film is like, which is exceptionally sophisticated, very elegant, with a lot of extremely careful framing. So you see that even in these production stills. Another example of that, one of the lead characters in the film, so this is Nadia, who has a relationship with a married man. So she's, kind of this ambiguous figure from the morality point of the film, and she's doing very well, thank you, so that she's got this apartment which is sort of full of these decorative items, and of course this very handsome dog, a pedigree Dalmatian, which is about as kind of usual as a tiger, really, in this period of Soviet history. There was limited discussion of the visuals here too, so just exactly what I was saying earlier, excellent work by the camera operator. Then something much more interesting being said about the way that the sound works. So the studio director, Ilya Kiselyov, so he's the general director, the boss of the entire studio, makes a couple of very good points actually about the way that the fade on the sound is being used, but is prepared just to say, okay, great camera work. That's all he says about it. Equally, a rare comment on the visuals later on, which is actually a Gaskino, is the curator, so the liaison officer, who gave Lenfilm a lot of trouble. The liaison officer, Igor Chekin, sort of says there's a mismatch between the soundtrack and the visuals, but that's all he says. Now I have here 3 examples. This is just to sort of finish the discussion, and we can sort of, move on to something else. I'll sort of obviously try and pull the sort of threads together. Here are 3 examples where the studio files actually tell us something about shots that were left out of the final film. So they become a way of sort of showing, exactly, or more or less exactly what would have been shown. Production stills, of course, they're not actually filmed while people are playing the scenes. They're filmed whilst they do a sort of static mock-up of the positions that they would adopt and part of the set, because you can't obviously take an attractive conventional shot of people when they've got their mouths open and are trying to say their lines. So they have to be literally stills. And here, if you compare this with the visuals, which I haven't done because of not wanting to sort of lead to total overload, what's missing is quite a lot of Nadia's leg here is missing from, in the finished version of the film. And also for some reason, the hanging behind them, possibly because it was distracting, and you've got sort of, it's considered a vice in Soviet photography when blikuyet, when you can see those white sort of splashes of light, sort of, that it's considered that's a technical fault. So possibly because of that also. Another case, a little less simple, of what ended up on the cutting room floor is a scene where Yuri, who is Nadia's lover, and one of this group of friends, turns up after the tragic death of the wife of another of his friends, who is an old flame of his, and she was the virtuous woman that he kind of passed over, and then he made this miserable marriage, and then he got this mistress, and then everything went down the plug, and they ended up total careerists. It's a very moralizing narrative. But anyway, his grief is such that he's dragged this enormous wreath in a large black car and driven way out into the Russian provinces. And there's a sort of scene which is there in the still photographs, which shows him standing beside this vast wreath. And that just isn't there in the final film. And here you have a sequence of shots. So there's the car, he gets out of the car, you could barely see the wreath. Then you see a little bit of it sort of right over to the side of the shot. When he arrives, I mean, actually, this should be read up, down, so left, top, left, bottom, right, top, right, bottom. So they run in that sequence. So an overhead shot of him walking through the cemetery, which you can barely see, and you have this sort of small knot of people who are there to commemorate the death of their close friend. Then you see, as I say, this sort of bleak shot of the wreath, just sort of indicating that it's very large. And then Yuri's face, so much more of a concentration on Yuri's upset and sort of personal grief over the death of one of his close friends. And we have here a kind of actually sort of direct evidence from the studio records of White. It may be that this has happened. So the theme of his love for Lyudmila, which is still not fully flickered out, the love that he sought to drive away, yet which still nags at him, does not sit well with his theatrical arrival holding a metal wreath. So it appears that this disappeared, actually quite an early stage of review of the film, and actually for aesthetic reasons rather than anything else. I mean, however you choose to see those. Finally, a case of, we haven't so far really had political censorship as such, but here is an absolutely overt case of political censorship with this film, and I think one has to use the term censorship. So the original script for the film contained, and it's actually that fragment of the director's scenario, or the sort of shooting script that I showed you, actually contains a bit of this scene. There was a long scene between another of the characters, so Volodya, and one of the other friends who's called Grisha, and Grisha is Jewish. And that's very clear to Soviet audiences because of what he looks like. I mean, he wears glasses, which is one sign. I mean, he also kind of has curly hair, which is kind of also tends to be a sign of that. There's a lot of sort of visual stereotyping. He's a doctor. I mean, that might be called a sort of, third part of the stereotype denominator. And so there was a long scene in which Volodya and Grisha sort of exchange news about what's happening, and it's clear that Grisha is rather unhappy. And this is what happens in the original shooting script. So Grisha puts his hands on the boy's forehead. This is the sort of adopted son of Volodya, and says, "Stick your tongue out for me now." The boy sticks out his tongue. Nothing to worry about. And then Grisha says, "In the train, I wanted to examine a sick child. The adults had hysterics and tried to punch me. See what we'll do, murderers in white coats." So this is a reference to the infamous episode in 1952 of the, the low killers in white coats. So the so-called Doctor's Plot, which was an entirely imaginary episode at which just represented kind of official anti-Semitism. A group of Moscow doctors working for the Kremlin polyclinics were alleged to have attempted to murder Stalin and various other people in the Kremlin leadership. And so Grisha is actually talking about this, and talking about how it's affected his life as a Jew. And he is a doctor, and somebody who's recognized as a Jew is practically physically attacked when he tries to do his work of actually healing a patient. In this particular case, a child. And so Volodya put his arms around Grisha. So where's Lyudmila? The final scene reads like this. Grisha says, "It's a difficult time in every way." So all the kind of incidental detail has completely disappeared, and there's just that one line which refers to anything. So an absolutely clear case of censorship there. And actually, the picture that I showed you here, this is also something that ended up on the cutting room floor. and I think probably relates to an intermediate stage of processing the film when they actually cut down the dialogue. So there's a little bit more for the two to say here, and their conversation, which is actually transferred from Volodya's home into a train compartment, lasted longer in intermediate versions than it does in the final film. So that sort of shows you, I mean, the third case about how visual data can show you something which is just not available from other sources about intermediate stages of processing the film. So this brings me to the end of my talk. So just to sort of sum up, I've been talking about how visual material is reviewed actually quite superficially in many ways in the Soviet film production process, and that actually a lot of effort is concentrated on the script. There's relatively little expertise, I mean, certainly at the highest levels in dealing with the visuals. And on the whole, therefore, the sort of removal of visual material tends to be somewhat haphazard, and it does perhaps conform more with censorship in the ordinary model than the whole process of treating the film does. The final thing is just to draw your attention to the figure on the right, because that is actually a film editor. So I had her on the, or her colleague rather, on the front page. And these are the people who actually sit at the editing table and do the taking out of images, but actually tend not to act on their own account, although if strongly trusted by the people they work with, and it's possible actually to get into that situation if you are a high-level editor, a recognized master, after a number of years. And then they sometimes propose taking things out, and that can actually be sometimes taken very well by film directors. So it's a complicated process. The editors, by the way, it's an almost totally feminized profession. I think in Lenfilm it's totally feminized. As I say, camera operators are almost totally masculine professions, so that's another way that we can look at this. But anyway, I've given you a sort of idea of how film management works, and I hope that, I mean, obviously it's not the sort of material this seminar usually deals with, but I hope it's not been completely boring and pointless as far as you're all concerned. Thank you very much.